It's the biggest visit by an Indian Prime Minister after the world has changed completely. The COVID pandemic on the one hand and the complete implosion and rise of terror in Afghanistan on the other. Many visits have been as important, but this one trumps them all. Prime Minister Modi's jam-packed tour to the US, he's in flight right now and will be landing early tomorrow morning in Washington, comes in the shadow of the rise of the Taliban. The Afghanistan crisis is likely to dominate Modi's discussions in the United States. Remember, it will be his first in-person meeting with President Joe Biden. Prime Minister Modi was the only leader, remember, to call out the Taliban government and warn the world of its threat. So that is going to be agenda issue number one.
The unforgettable American pullout. The blood-drenched aftermath. And the rise of Afghanistan's godfathers of terror. And while the rest of the world tiptoed around the new rulers of a collapsed country, only one leader found it fit to point out a finger directly at the Taliban.
अफगानिस्तान में सत्ता परिवर्तन इंक्लूसिव नहीं है और बिना नेगोशिएशन के हुआ है। इससे नई व्यवस्था की स्वीकार्यता पर सवाल उठते हैं।
It is in the echo of those words that the Indian Prime Minister begins his crucial United States visit that kicks off with the first in-person Quad summit. It is in the shadow of the Taliban's rise and its overwhelming implications for regional security that Modi now confabulates with the superpower that dropped Afghanistan like a hot potato and breaks bread with President Joe Biden for the first time. Modi and Biden have met virtually on at least 3 occasions: the Quad Virtual Summit in March, the Climate Change Summit in April, and the G7 Summit in June this year. But the Taliban's lightning power grab in Afghanistan has set the overwhelming tone for Modi's visit. The US pullout, a move that has jeopardized India's strategic interests in Afghanistan, will get top billing in discussions. Though the Indian security establishment is clear that America has tried to wash its hands, China's shadow in Afghanistan ensures the United States cannot ever walk away completely. As the United States itself now breaks bread with the very Taliban it once hunted, navigating the dynamics of regional security will be Modi's biggest challenge. From Washington, Modi will travel to New York to address the general debate of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly on September 25th in New York. Here too, India's focus will remain the situation in Afghanistan and terrorism emanating from Pakistan. Multiple intelligence alerts have told India that the Al-Qaeda, ISIS Khorasan and other groups could be diverted to escalate violence in Kashmir. On this issue too, the Prime Minister has cleared decks on India's stand at the SCO summit.
अफगानिस्तान में हाल के घटनाक्रम का सबसे अधिक प्रभाव हम जैसे पड़ोसी देशों पर होगा। हमें मिलकर सुनिश्चित करना चाहिए कि अफगानिस्तान की धरती का उपयोग किसी भी देश में आतंकवाद फैलाने के लिए न हो।
While Pakistan, the emboldened new stakeholder in Afghanistan, is likely to attempt to derail all conversations at the UN again by raising Kashmir at the UN, India will remain focused on the issue of terrorism, regional security and Afghanistan. While the Quad nations will also center around the Afghanistan issue and the Chinese threat, all eyes will be on how Modi and Biden decide to work together as allies in a world that just became much more dangerous. With Geeta Mohan in Washington, D.C., Bureau Report, India Today.
So Prime Minister Modi is now mid-air somewhere over the world. He'll be landing at 3:30 a.m. in Washington, D.C. to begin what is going to be his most important visit since the pandemic. It's a power-packed schedule, as you can imagine. He's already left for the United States. The highlight of the visit will be the first in-person meeting Joe Biden, who is the host at the White House. Prime Minister Modi and the US President will also be meeting on Friday for the first time for bilateral talks in person. Also, after becoming the president, it will be the first in-person meeting of these two men. They've both met in an earlier avatar when Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat and when Joe Biden was a senator. Now, Prime Minister Modi will be meeting the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, who is, of course, of Indian origin, to reinforce the strategic partnership between the United States and India. He will also be holding bilateral talks with his Japanese and Australian counterparts. Prime Minister Modi will also be meeting top CEOs of major American companies in Washington, including the CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, as well as the chief of Boeing. Modi will then be addressing the UN General Assembly on the 25th of September. That's this Saturday. The main focus will be on rising radicalism, vaccine shortages in the world, and, of course, the dominant issue of the Afghanistan crisis. Now, remember, Prime Minister Modi has so far shaken hands with two presidents of the United States. It began with Obama, and then there was Trump. Viral images in both those presidencies, both with Obama, the famous hug, and the famous victory lap by Modi and Trump. And now all eyes will be on the Modi-Biden body language and what these two leaders can achieve. But as we await those first images of the Modi-Biden Milan, now I want to take you back to 1949 to when the India-US tryst actually began. We're talking about Modi-Biden 2021, but the Jab We Met US President affair only began in 1949 when Prime Minister Nehru met President Harry Truman of the United States. Take a look at this historical perspective of when our prime ministers met their presidents.
Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister of India and the Orient's greatest political and spiritual leader, flies to Washington on one of the most important state visits of recent years.
1949, the first visit by newly independent India's Prime Minister to the United States. Prime Minister Nehru and President Truman, the world's oldest democracy and the youngest democracy, in an embrace of infinite possibilities. But things didn't begin well. And in a world with deep post-war divisions, Nehru's policy of non-alignment and neutrality kept America at arm's length. A decade later, independent India hosted the first visit by a US president. President Dwight Eisenhower and Prime Minister Nehru strengthened a flagging relationship. But Nehru's policy of non-alignment would stand firm and keep India away from forging any substantial India-US relationship. Things improved dramatically in the years that followed with a young, new generation president in the White House. In 1962, the John F. Kennedy administration openly supported India during the 1962 Sino-Indian War and considered Chinese action as blatant Chinese communist aggression against India. Support that provided great hope of a burgeoning friendship.
We are in touch with the Indian government to determine their assessment of it. In order to better assess Indian needs, we are sending a team to New Delhi.
But the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 would bring that momentum to a grinding halt and foretold a sudden slide in relations. The next president of the White House, Lyndon Johnson, wasn't a big fan of India and did much to reverse all the gains his predecessors had made. President Johnson, while maintaining ties with India, began America's relationship with Pakistan, not only to ease tensions with China, but also to contain India's rise. Pakistan would flaunt American military hardware in the 1965 war with India, with tanks and fighter aircraft proving to have an edge over India's own. Even though Pakistan was still ultimately defeated and contained. But nose-diving relations between Delhi and Washington would hit rock bottom only when the next US president arrived. Taking his predecessor's Pakistan friendliness and bolstering it with massive military aid, President Richard Nixon fully pushed India into the proverbial arms of the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War. The cold, frosty Nixon-Indira Gandhi relationship would soon enter the realms of national security. In 1971, when Indira Gandhi's India mounted a ferocious campaign to liberate East Pakistan, President Nixon sent the USS Enterprise aircraft carrier to the Bay of Bengal to intimidate India. A ploy that didn't work, the war ending in a blistering military defeat for Pakistan and the birth of Bangladesh. India's first nuclear tests in 1974 were frowned upon by President Nixon. But with no real relations, there were no sanctions to be applied on India. Following India's emergency, two new national leaders, Prime Minister Morarji Desai and President Jimmy Carter, would gradually attempt to rescue relations between the two countries. Even though India did not support the US invasion of Afghanistan by the turn of the decade.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and Mrs. Reagan.
But it was the next US President, Ronald Reagan, who pushed the button on a slew of military supply programs for India, including help with the newborn Light Combat Aircraft project. Through the turbulent 80s, the Reagan administration and India, under Indira and then her son Rajiv Gandhi, would continue to build on ties, ever aware of how fragile they had proven to be in the past.
Good afternoon.
The Bill Clinton P.V. Narasimha Rao years are seen by contemporary historians as a time of missed opportunities and contradictory policies. In the early 90s, India had just flipped the difficult switch on economic liberalization, but was also dealing with the beginnings of militancy and Pakistan-sponsored terrorism in Kashmir. The restoration of American aid to Pakistan in 1995 by President Clinton would give India the impetus it needed to go the distance in its nuclear ambitions. Three years later, here in the wastelands of Pokhran, Rajasthan, a bomb was literally dropped on India-US relations.
Today, at 15:45 hours, India conducted 3 underground nuclear tests in the Pokhran range. These tests conducted today were with a fission device, a low-yield device, and a thermonuclear device.
India's arrival on the nuclear stage in 1998 under Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee triggered an instantaneous reaction from Washington. President Clinton instantly ordered sanctions against India, cutting off all military and economic aid and freezing loans by American banks to the Indian public sector. All the good work done under the Reagan administration in the 80s came to an end. But the sanctions turned out to be a dud and did nothing to stop India's economic rise. In 2000, by the turn of the millennium, when President Clinton visited India after the Kargil War, it was seen as the beginning of a renewed, tentative friendship.
This is terrorist.
But it was the following administration in Washington under President George W. Bush, in the weeks and months after the 9/11 terror attacks, that truly pushed a partnership with India.
Mr. Prime Minister, welcome to the United States.
Centered around the common enemy of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism, India and the United States forged a strategic partnership that became the seed from which everything would grow going forward, including everything you see today.
Of India's complete support in this.
Things were finally moving forward strategically and at a steady clip. In 2002-2003, India and the US would hold their first Malabar naval exercise, a military drill that has become the centerpiece of today's Quad partnership. Gone were the inhibitions of the past. With a track record of suspicion and hostile policy action, the two nations were ready to embrace for real. That new relationship enshrined in the 2008 India-US Civil Nuclear Agreement, which Manmohan Singh staked his very prime ministership on. There would be no looking back. Under President George W. Bush and then under President Obama, the Manmohan Singh administration would open the gates to huge military armament supplies from the United States, with deals for transport aircraft, maritime surveillance jets, missiles, combat helicopters, and much else. In 2007, the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Strategic Dialogue, would take birth. A strategic partnership between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. But it would take another 10 years for it to fully take form. Meanwhile, the India-US weapons deals were sweetening the pipeline and paving the way for the first truly interpersonal relationship between an Indian Prime Minister and a US President. First, this hug in Washington, and then this hug in India. Entwined in these warm gestures was the fact that a Prime Minister who had earlier been blocked for entry by the United States was now a favored friend and an ally in the region. And but for a few bristling comments over the years on the topic of discrimination and unity, Modi and Obama held the alliance together in strong hands, pushing it across the realms of trade, strategic affairs, and culture. But if Modi and Obama exuded the Jhappiwala warmth, the next relationship would explode in terms of camaraderie and body language. Famously, the Howdy Modi event in Houston in 2019, when Modi and President Donald Trump would take what looked like victory laps in front of a hysterical diaspora crowd. Another viral moment was this one, when the bonhomie spilt over at the G7 summit in France. And finally, right before the COVID-19 pandemic would change the world forever, the massive Namaste Trump event at the Motera Stadium in Gujarat in 2020, where the two leaders emblazoned their friendship in the consciousness of history books. And finally now, in a world that has changed dramatically in the last 18 months, stand the leaders of the two countries once again. From the COVID pandemic, to the rise of ISIS, to the collapse of Afghanistan. In their hands are the aspirations, safety, and prosperity of billions, and literally peace in this new world we've inherited. What Modi and Biden forge and the partnership they craft will be something the world will be counting on. And that meeting between Modi and Biden will happen in just a few hours from now, 3:30 a.m. Our time tomorrow is when Prime Minister Modi lands in Washington. Here's a curtain raiser, tells you everything you need to know about what stands to be achieved on this visit.
The stage is set for Namaste America. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 3-day visit to the United States is significant on many counts.
ये जो दृश्य है, ये अकल्पनीय है.
He will be attending the first in-person meeting of the Quad leaders.
Now, Prime Minister Modi, I'm kicking it over to you. And again, it's great to see you.
His biggest foreign trip since the COVID pandemic will also be his first to the US after President Joe Biden took charge. Prime Minister Modi has a packed itinerary in the US. He reaches Washington, D.C. late night on Wednesday. The next morning, he will meet Apple chief Tim Cook. But the highlight of the day would be his meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris.
I, Kamala Devi Harris, solemnly swear
that I will support. Remember, Prime Minister Modi had congratulated Harris on becoming the first woman US Vice President, calling her election a historic occasion.
foreign and domestic. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Modi will be holding bilateral meets with its Australian and Japanese counterparts, Scott Morrison and Yoshihide Suga. and the trio will be hosted by Biden for a dinner. On Friday, Modi and Biden will hold a bilateral meet at the White House.
One of the highlights of the visit is the Prime Minister's meeting with the US President, President Joe Biden in the White House. You are undoubtedly aware that this would be the Prime Minister's first in-person meeting with President Biden.
Both the leaders have met thrice virtually. The Quad Summit in March, the Climate Change Summit in April, and the G7 Summit this year. Prime Minister Modi will then be attending the Quad Leaders Summit at the White House. The grouping of four, the United States, India, Australia and Japan, is designed as a counter to China in a bid to secure the Asia-Pacific region.
We'll do so with our allies and partners through cooperation at multilateral institutions like the United Nations to amplify our collective strength and speed our progress toward dealing with these global challenges.
After a series of hectic meetings, Prime Minister Modi will travel to New York to address the UN General Assembly on Saturday. The key focus will be the situation in Afghanistan and Pakistan's continuous patronage to terrorism. Prime Minister Modi has already spelt out India's stand on the new Taliban administration at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit last week.
अफगानिस्तान में सत्ता परिवर्तन इंक्लूसिव नहीं है और बिना नेगोशिएशन के हुआ है। इससे नई व्यवस्था की स्वीकार्यता पर सवाल उठते हैं।
The meetings on the highest global stage signal a new world order. US President Joe Biden has announced an end to relentless wars and a beginning of relentless diplomacy. Emerging from a COVID pandemic, the biggest humanitarian crisis in 100 years, the world has new challenges ahead. With Geeta Mohan, Bureau Report, India Today.
Of the most diverse and welcoming city in the United States.